The wind howled like a thing long grieving, whipping snow into stinging needles against the single window of the cabin. Inside, Hannah pressed her forehead against the frigid glass, the patterns of frost intricate as lace, yet holding none of the gentle beauty of the lace she had known in drawing rooms back east. Here, frost was a barrier, a symbol of the merciless world outside. Just 2 months ago, she had been Hannah Abernathy, wife of a rising merchant, residing in a house of brick and comfort, surrounded by familiar sounds and textures. Now, she was nothing, save a shivering woman cloaked in threadbare grief, trapped in the brutal silence of the wilderness with a man the few locals spoke of only in hushed, wary tones. Her husband, Thomas, gone. Swept away by a flash flood on a river they had thought easily forded. Their wagon, their supplies, their hopes for a new life in a booming territory town, all devoured by the churning water. She had clung to a fallen log, battered and bruised, eventually washing ashore miles downstream, alone save for the tattered dress on her back and the chilling weight of despair in her soul. Days she had wandered, a ghost in a world that seemed determined to erase her, until she collapsed near a crude, hidden cabin, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something wilder, something untamed. He had found her there, a man who seemed less man and more element, blended into the harsh landscape he inhabited, Beckett, the Hermit. Folk in the distant, struggling settlement of Hope Creek whispered tales of his isolation, his strange ways, his eyes that saw too much and said too little. Some called him dangerous, others simply mad. All avoided him. When he had first knelt over her, his face shadowed by a tangled beard, his eyes the color of storm-bruised skies, she had felt a primal fear, sharper than the hunger gnawing at her belly. He hadn't offered a hand, hadn't spoken a word of comfort. He had simply observed her, his gaze unsettlingly direct, before scooping her up with surprising gentleness that belied his rough exterior and carrying her into the cabin. Life in the cabin had settled into a rhythm dictated by necessity and underscored by profound silence. Beckett was a creature of habit, rising before dawn, tending his snares, checking traps, chopping wood with tireless efficiency. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed impossible for a man of his build. His presence felt more than heard. He provided food, lean rabbit, tough squirrel, fish pulled from an ice-bound stream. He kept the fire going, a stubborn heart of warmth in the cold. He did these things with a detached purpose, as if tending to a stray animal that had inconveniently appeared on his doorstep. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was low, gravelly, the words clipped and functional. Eat, wood, sleep, commands, not invitations. He offered no explanation for his solitude, no curiosity about her past. He existed in the present, a sentinel against the wilderness. Hannah, in turn, had retreated into herself. The shock of Thomas's death, the loss of everything, the sheer terror of her situation, it had all built a wall around her heart, cold and impermeable as the cabin's stone hearth before the fire was lit. She watched Beckett with a mixture of fear, dependence, and a strange, reluctant awe at his ability to simply be in this place. She attempted small tasks, sweeping the dirt floor with a bundle of pine boughs, mending a tear in her dress with thread pulled from the hem, washing their few dishes in melted snow. Her efforts felt clumsy, inadequate. She felt useless, a burden. This feeling chafed against the memory of her former life, a life where her worth was measured by her grace, her social standing, her ability to manage a household of servants. That Hannah was gone, as surely as Thomas was. This new Hannah was a raw, exposed nerve, bundled in borrowed deerskins that smelled faintly of smoke and wild things. The cabin was small, one room dominated by the hearth, a rough table, 2 stools, and 2 pallets of furs on opposite sides of the fire. There was no privacy, only space shared in uneasy silence. At night, the sounds of the wilderness pressed close, the groan of timbers, the shriek of the wind, the distant call of an owl. Hannah would lie awake, listening to Beckett's steady breathing across the fire, a small, irrational comfort in the overwhelming emptiness. One evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows on the log walls, Hannah shivered, pulling the thin blanket tighter. Beckett, sharpening a knife by the firelight, paused. His gaze met hers across the flames, and for the first time it lingered, not with assessment, but with something that might have been recognition. "Cold?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Hannah nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. The simple question, the hint of concern, was a crack in the wall she had built. Without a word, he rose and fetched a heavy, worn fur from his own pallet. He tossed it towards her. "Use this," he said, his voice gruff again, as if regretting the moment of softness. She caught it, the fur surprisingly soft, warm with his body heat. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling it around her shoulders. It smelled strongly of him, the clean scent of pine and wood smoke and something earthy. It was the first gift she had received in this new, brutal existence, and it felt impossibly precious. Slowly, painstakingly, the ice between them began to thaw, not melt completely, but crack along the edges. It wasn't through grand gestures or heartfelt conversations. It was in the small things. He left a particularly tender piece of meat from a kill for her. He showed her how to tell the age of a tree by its rings. She, tentatively at first, began to clean their few tin plates without being asked, organizing the small collection of dried herbs he kept. One afternoon, while he was out, she found a small, hand-carved wooden bird perched on a shelf. It was simple, unpainted, but intricately detailed, a sparrow mid-flight. She picked it up, turning it in her fingers. It felt smooth, warm from the cabin's air. Why would a man like Beckett carve something so delicate? When he returned, his eyes fixed on the bird in her hand, a shudder seemed to fall over his face. "My mother," he said, the words pulled from him like roots from frozen ground. She liked birds. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared. Hannah held the bird gently. "It's beautiful, Beckett." He grunted, turning away to hang up his rifle, but not before she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, memory, perhaps pain. Another day she found herself asking about the land. "How do you know where to find everything? The plants? The animals?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. "You listen," he said eventually, his gaze drifting to the window. "The land tells you. The wind, the snow patterns, the way the trees lean, it's all talking." He began to show her, in short, practical lessons. How to identify the tracks of a rabbit in the snow, which berries were safe to eat when spring arrived, how to find kindling that would catch quickly. He taught her about the rhythms of the wild, a world away from the predictable, ordered world she had known. She was a clumsy student, her hands unaccustomed to the cold and the rough work, but she learned with a fierce determination she hadn't known she possessed. Each small skill learned felt like another tiny brick in the foundation of a new self. He, in turn, seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly. He no longer looked at her as just a responsibility. He watched her efforts, sometimes correcting gently, sometimes letting her figure it out. He even offered a rare, crooked smile when she successfully started a fire with a flint and steel on her own. "You're learning," he'd said, and the simple praise had warmed her more than the flames. She started talking, too, hesitant at first, about her life before. Not about the grief that remained a private, heavy stone, but about the small details, the smell of the baker's shop, the feel of silk, the sound of music. He listened, his gaze steady, offering no judgment, only quiet attention. It was like unwrapping a part of herself she had thought frozen solid. The spring came reluctantly, melting the snow in slow, muddy stages. The world outside the cabin turned from stark white to muted greens and browns. The air grew milder, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Hannah felt a flicker of hope, a tentative stirring within her that had been dormant through the long, harsh winter. She was stronger now, leaner, her hands calloused, her face weathered by the wind and sun. She was still Hannah, but she was also something new, something forged in the crucible of loss and survival. Their fragile peace was shattered one dusty afternoon. They were outside, mending the small fence around Beckett's meager garden plot, when they heard it, the distant sound of horses and voices. Not the sounds of the wilderness, but human intrusion. Beckett's head snapped up, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle but firm. "Inside, now." He pushed her towards the cabin, his eyes scanning the tree line with intense focus. Inside, he barred the door, checked his rifle, and peered through a crack in the logs. "Who is it?" Hannah whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear she had learned to manage in his presence returned, but now it was directed outward, towards the approaching noise. "Trouble," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Heard talk in Hope Creek about a woman out here. Some men got ideas." Men with ideas. The phrase sent a chill down her spine. The wilderness had been brutal, but it had been indifferent. Human malice was a different, more terrifying prospect. The riders emerged from the trees, 3 of them, rough-looking and carrying rifles. They pulled up a distance from the cabin, eyes narrowed, assessing the small, isolated dwelling. "Beckett," one of them bellowed. His name, shouted here, felt like a violation. "Heard you got yourself a woman out here. That true?" Beckett didn't respond, only held his rifle steady, watching. Another man, Brody, squinted towards the cabin. "Little bird told us she's a looker. Fancy Eastern goods," they said. A low, unpleasant chuckle rippled through the small group. Hannah instinctively shrank back from the crack in the wall, pressing herself against the logs. Her stomach churned. The way they spoke, the hunger in their voices, it was clear they saw her not as a person, but as property, something to be taken. "She ain't nobody's business," Beckett finally called back, his voice carrying with surprising strength. "Turn around. Go back." Brody laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Now, Beckett, that ain't neighborly. We just want to see her, maybe share a drink. Maybe she's lonely out here with just a quiet fella like you." He dismounted, starting to walk towards the cabin. "Stop," Beckett warned, raising his rifle slightly. Brody ignored him, smirking. "Come on now, Hermit. Don't make this hard." The crackle of a twig under Brody's boot sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Beckett fired. The shot echoed through the trees, sharp and sudden. Brody yelped, clutching his shoulder, stumbling back. He hadn't been aiming to kill, Hannah realized, only to warn, to wound, just enough to deter. The other 2 men shouted, pulling their rifles. They fired wildly towards the cabin, the bullets thudding against the logs. "Get down," Beckett yelled, pulling Hannah to the floor next to him. They lay there, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. More shots rang out, splintering wood near the window. "They'll try to rush us," Beckett muttered, reloading his rifle with practiced speed, "or wait us out." Waiting them out wouldn't work. They had limited supplies, and these men clearly weren't leaving anytime soon. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon. Darkness would give the attackers an advantage. "We have to fight," Hannah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but beneath it, a fierce resolve had ignited. She wouldn't be taken, not after surviving everything else. Beckett glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Then, a nod. "Aye, we fight." He handed her a heavy branch he used as a poker for the fire. "Keep low. If they get close, use this." It felt clumsy and inadequate, but she gripped it tightly. She understood. She wasn't a marksman, couldn't handle a rifle, but she could defend herself if they breached the cabin. They waited, listening to the movements outside. The injured man, Brody, was cursing loudly. The others were moving stealthily, trying to flank the cabin. Beckett moved silently from crack to crack, watching, listening. Hannah stayed low, straining her ears, her eyes darting around the small cabin, looking for anything at all, that could be used. As the light faded, the temperature began to drop. The wind picked up again, carrying the first whispers of a coming storm. Hannah felt a prickle of unease. They had survived the winter, but a late storm, unexpected and fierce, could be just as deadly. One of the men, a hulking brute named Fletcher, suddenly rushed the front door, axe in hand. Beckett fired, hitting the axe, sending sparks flying and the man stumbling back with a yell of pain and frustration. "Think you're smart, Hermit. We'll burn you out," Brody screamed from a distance. Panic flared in Hannah's chest. Fire. The cabin was tinder dry. "They won't," Beckett said, his voice calm despite the tension. "Storm's coming, too much snow." He was right. As if on cue, fat, heavy snowflakes began to fall, quickly coating the ground, obscuring the already dim light. The wind intensified, swirling the snow into blinding eddies. This was their chance. Beckett looked at her, his eyes intense in the gloom. "The back way," he mouthed, pointing towards a small, rarely used opening near the hearth, usually covered by furs. "Lead 'em off." Hannah nodded, understanding immediately. Beckett would lure them away, using the storm and his knowledge of the terrain to disappear. she would stay hidden. "No," she whispered back, surprising herself. "We go together." His brow furrowed. "Too dangerous, you slow me down." "I can move quietly," she insisted. "And I know the path you showed me to the rock shelter. We can hide there. They won't follow you far in this storm, not with Brody wounded." He hesitated, assessing her face in the dim light. He saw not the fragile Eastern lady he had found, but the woman who had endured months in his world, who had learned to listen to the land. He saw resilience. "All right," he agreed, a muscle flexing in his jaw. "Stay close, don't make a sound." The storm raged outside, a maelstrom of wind and snow. It was a furious, wild thing, but this time Hannah didn't fear it. She saw it as an ally. Beckett unbarred the back exit, easing it open. A blast of freezing wind and snow swirled into the cabin. He went first, melting into the white chaos. Hannah followed, pulling the borrowed fur tight around her, the branch still clutched in her hand. The snow was already ankle-deep, the wind ripping at her clothes. Visibility was almost zero. She could barely see Beckett, just a darker shape ahead of her, moving with swift, silent purpose. She focused on his retreating back, placing her feet where he had placed his, trying to be as quiet as he was. Behind them, they heard shouts, curses, the sound of men struggling against the storm. They hadn't noticed the back exit had been used. Beckett led her through the familiar woods, now transformed into a disorienting maze by the storm. He seemed guided by instinct, by a connection to the land Hannah could only glimpse. He navigated around trees, over fallen logs, through drifts, always just a few steps ahead. They heard the attackers thrashing about near the cabin, still shouting, realizing they had been outsmarted. Their frustration echoed faintly through the storm. "They won't track us in this," Beckett muttered, not stopping. "Not far. They'll head back or freeze." He found the rock shelter, a deep overhang barely visible beneath a mantle of snow. It offered scant protection from the wind, but it was hidden, a place to wait out the worst of the storm. They huddled together beneath the overhang, shivering. The cold seeped into her bones. Beckett pulled her closer, sharing the warmth of his body, wrapping the fur around them both. She leaned into him, grateful for the heat, for the solid presence beside her. "They're gone," he said after a long time, his voice low, raspy. The shouting had faded completely, replaced by the relentless roar of the wind and the hiss of the snow. Hannah nodded, too cold to speak much. She felt the tremor in his own body, the tension that was only now starting to drain away. They stayed there until dawn, the storm gradually abating. When the sky began to lighten, the world was transformed, blanketed in pristine white. The cabin was a dark shape in the distance, untouched by fire. They returned slowly, carefully, scanning for any sign of the men. There was nothing, just the vast, silent wilderness, unmarked, save for their own tracks leading back to the cabin. Inside it was cold, the fire long dead. Hannah knelt at the hearth, her fingers stiff, and began to painstakingly rebuild it, using the skills Beckett had taught her. He watched her, his expression unreadable. When the fire was finally blazing, casting a warm, golden light, they sat by it, warming their hands, the silence between them different now. It wasn't the wary, empty silence of their first months together, but a quiet, shared space filled with the echo of their survival. Beckett broke it. "They won't come back," he said, stating it as a fact. "Not after that." Hannah nodded, believing him. They had faced down human threat and the fury of nature, and they had done it together. "Thank you," she said, looking at him, really looking at him. The tangled beard, the weathered face, the eyes that still held a wildness, but also, now, something softer, something seen, "for saving me." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the layers beneath the rough exterior, the man who had carved the tiny bird, the man who listened to the land, the man who had protected her with his life. "You saved yourself too," he said, his voice rough. "Out there, you didn't run." She hadn't. The pampered lady from the east was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the bite of the wind, the taste of wild meat, and the feel of a branch clutched in defense. "What happens now?" she asked softly. The world outside was still vast and unforgiving, but the immediate threat had passed. What was next? Beckett looked into the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes. "Now," he said slowly, deliberately, "we make a life. He didn't say I make a life or you make a life, he said we. The word settled between them, heavy with implication. It was a promise, a possibility, a choice offered in the quiet aftermath of violence and storm. Hannah felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It started in her chest and reached outwards, thawing the last frozen corners of her grief. She had lost everything. Yes. But here, in this remote cabin, with this solitary, unexpected man, she had found something else. Something real, something solid. We, she echoed, testing the word. It felt right. It felt like home. Beckett turned to her then, his gaze searching, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. He reached out a hand, calloused and strong, and gently touched her cheek. His skin was rough, but his touch was tender. Hannah, he said, just her name, but it held the weight of acknowledgement, of acceptance, of connection forged in shared hardship. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. The journey had been long, brutal, marked by unimaginable loss. She had been adrift, isolated by grief and the harsh reality of the frontier. But here, in the silence of the cabin, with the scent of wood smoke in the air and the quiet strength of Beckett beside her, she found not just survival, but the unexpected, precious possibility of a future. It wouldn't be the life she had planned, but it would be a life, lived together, earned through fire and snow and the slow, hard work of two wounded souls finding solace and strength in each other. The pampered lady and the feral hermit, they were just Hannah and Beckett now, and the vast, wild land outside was no longer just a place to endure, but a place where their new life would take root.